Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Museum of London for a Gresham lecture. Dr. Bernard Stonehouse, Maritime Historical Studies Centre, University of Hull, on the Greenlanders, Arctic whaling. My name is Michael Mainelli. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Commerce at Gresham and one of the Gresham Fellows, and it's my delight to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. I think it's brilliant, given the weather we've had lately, that the hall is full and the air conditioning's on high, and we have this nice cooling picture behind me, which I hope puts us all in the right mood. Now, this afternoon starts our 2011 series of Mondays at 1. And as many of you are aware, Mondays at 1 attempts to sustain a theme across a series of lectures, drawing on the expertise of guest lecturers. In the spring, we'll be looking at the lost hospitals of London, but starting today, this autumn series comprises 4 lectures on the great days of sail. Professor Connell, who with Professor Cox organizes Mondays at 1, couldn't be with us today, and desiring someone with a nautical connection, asked me to introduce the series. As many of you may know, my wife and I own and run the Thames sailing barge Lady Daphne, in the hopes of keeping some of these historic trading vessels alive. And I'm very interested, therefore, in at least 2 of the forthcoming lectures. First, They Live by Trade, Britain's Global Trade in the Great Days of Sail, which is on the 10th of October, and Why Conserve the Cutty Sark on the 17th of October. But the more ignoble bits of sail and trade cannot be ignored either, and on the 24th of October, we'll be hosting our 4th lecture, Slavery, Ships, and Sickness, while today's lecture covers whaling. Well, what of today's lecture? Well, I've never been to Greenland, sadly, but I have some tentative connections to the Arctic and to whaling. I've been to the Arctic or near Arctic a few times, but I've only sailed as far as north as 60 degrees. The Arctic starts at 66 degrees. And when I got up there, it was so cold it induced a near mutiny amongst my crew in the Shetlands near Unst. And that was in the summer. But that's another story. I'm on firmer ground on whaling, as I'm involved with 2 organizations trying to help whales. The first is Ocean Alliance, founded by Dr. Roger Payne, who popularized humpback whale songs in the 1960s and 1970s and inspired my undying love of Kate Bush's music. Now, back in November 2008, Roger presented a performance of Sea Change at Gresham College with his wife, Lisa Harrow, the actress. And my second organization is the International Fund for Animal Welfare, which co-hosted Sidney Holt's challenging 2008 Gresham lecture, Shall Future Generations Eat Fish or Whales? Now, today, Dr. Stonehouse is going to help us explore our history. Back in 1576, the Muscovy Company was awarded a monopoly to kill whales. And while the 35-ton Grace of Bristol sailed to Newfoundland in 1594 to trade whale products with the Basque, it wasn't until 1611 that the Muscovy Company's first whaling expedition set sail. Whaling today seems repugnant and uncivilized to many, but Dr. Stonehouse's British Arctic whaling website reminds us, few today regret the end of British whaling. Fewer still would want to see it revived or encouraged in any form. For all its products, there are now reasonable alternatives, and most nations agree that whaling is no longer needed. This was not the case in the 16th to mid-19th centuries, or even in the early 20th century, when British whaling finally ceased. To judge whalers of those times by standards of today makes no sense at all. If we seek to judge, we must, in fairness, know more of the circumstances in which they worked. Whaling, particularly in the Arctic, was tough and dangerous, and many ships were lost. As a professor of commerce, I have to ask, why did people risk so much? What did they gain? Why did they stop? To answer those questions and tell us about the circumstances in which whalers worked, would you please welcome Dr. Bernard Stonehouse.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Whaling put bread on tables at the time that I'm speaking about, and that's how, if we can justify it at all, that was the justification for it. We were dealing with a time of extreme poverty in the agricultural sector. At the beginning of the industrial age, again poverty in the towns and cities, and that was what whaling. That was what encouraged whaling and kept it going. So I make no excuses for these whalers. They were doing a very good and very difficult job at the time. I'm more glad than you can imagine to know that whaling no longer exists from Britain anyway. And there's very little of it going on in the world at all now. I did get involved with Antarctic whalers for a time in the 1950s and 1960s when I was working down in South Georgia. And they got a great regard for the whalers themselves, but certainly not for the job they were doing, but certainly they were an unusual and very interesting crowd. And that's, I measure the whalers of the period that I'm talking about now by what I knew of the Antarctic whalers back in the 50s. Well, you've had a chance to have a look at some whaling ships while we've been waiting. Here are one or two more. This is all artwork, and incidentally, all the photographs all the paintings that I'm showing you are from the Hull Maritime Museum. These were all fairly typical whaling ships of the size range. They say all about the same size range. They were about as wide as this room and about 3 times as long. That's just to put them into scale. All of the order of 350 tons. I'll tell you what that means in a moment. These were painted largely by sign painters, itinerant sign painters who used to go around Britain painting pub signs and that sort of thing. Some of them had actually been to the Arctic and some hadn't, and you can tell that if you know anything about ice, you can tell the difference. The ones who hadn't been made the icebergs look like ice cream cones. The ones who had just got it right, got the ice right. This is one of the best that I know. There's a lot of ice in that picture. Those 3 ships had got themselves into extreme difficulties, a very embarrassing situation. And I'll tell you more about that right at the end of the lecture. I've put the emphasis on the ships because this is part of the series about sailing, sail, and then everything else follows from that because, of course, the ships are the key to the whole operation. Well, that is a very useful introduction, by the way. Thank you very much, because you've saved me saying an awful lot about the period up to the time that I'm interested in here, which is the period from 1749. There was very little whaling before that. In 1733, the British government supported whaling with a bounty. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. It didn't work at first because the bounty wasn't enough, but in 1749 they increased it, and the bounty was based on the tonnage of the ship. And 40 shillings per ton of ship was quite a deal in those days. Again, more about that later. But that is the size of the industry. You don't hear much about it these days. A lot of it was from London. Not far from where we are now is the Greenland dock. And that was where the Greenland ships from London accumulated. I got together. There was as many as 100 working out of London in the 1780s. Well, you don't hear much about it. Whaling isn't a popular subject these days, but it was a perfectly honourable and honoured profession in its time. And a lot of the smaller towns got involved too. Well, they were called the Greenlanders. Both the men and the ships were called the Greenlanders because they were working on either side of Greenland. They worked up to Svalbard. We're down here, of course. And you went up from these ports and you went up to Svalbard. Or later on, you went all the way across here and right up into there. And later still, you went right up into there and right up into Baffin Bay and then came back down that side. And if you got away with it, you were very fortunate. Anyhow, the Greenlanders were a race apart. They were Some of them had started out as fishermen, but not all of them had by any means. But they'd all started out as seamen who turned into whalers, and then it was a bit like the SAS to the army. They were a very special corps. And if there was a fight going on in the pubs, in any of the pubs in the whaling towns, you could bet your life the Greenlanders were at the bottom of it somewhere. Well, now what about these ships? Well, there were ships of about, as I say, not less than 100, never less than about 200 tons, because they wouldn't have been able to push their way through the ice. Never more than about 400 tons, because if they were as big as that, they were too big. They were taking far too many men down, and they were not economical. That term burthen comes in, and they were typically cats. Well, now what's burthen? It's a measure of capacity. A tonnage, T-U-N-N-A-G-E, was the number of barrels of wine that you could put into the hold of a ship. Well, that changed over the years, but the tonnage, the burthen, the tonnage that I'm talking about, was based on the length and the breadth. And if you do that sum very quickly in your head, you'll realize that this ship, which was about, as I say, about 3 times the length of this room and about the same width, was about 359 tons. What's a cat? Well, it's a strongly built sailing ship, very typically built in Whitby, but also built in Newcastle, on Tyneside, Wearside, around the Thames. It was a very popular brand of ship, if you like, very capacious and simply used for carrying cargo. These were the 10 and 50 ton lorries of the day. They used to go up and down the east coast of Britain in the way that the big lorries go up and down the M1 and A1 today. And they could carry up to about 600 tons of coal. If you want to see a picture of one, and I think it's probably still there, there's a pub down in Wapping called the Prospect of Whitby. Prospect of Whitby was a cat, it was a Whitby cat. It used to have a very good sign on the outside, a little bit over idealised, I think, but of a Whitby cat in full sail. So if it's still there, go down to the pub in Wapping, there you'll see a Whitby cat. 3-masted, ship-rigged or bark-rigged. Ship-rigged simply meant that they had square sails on all 3 masts. Bark-rigged, they had square sails on 2 masts and a 4.5 sail on the back. The local ones are oak-built, but when they were being built in India and a lot were built in America as well, after the colonies had been established in America along the eastern seaboard there, while they were building them of local timber there. As a cargo ship, they took a crew of about 10 or 12, half of whom would probably have been apprentices. As whalers, they had to take 40 or 50 because, look, all the whaling was actually done by these boats, and each of those required at least 6 and possibly 7 men. So you had to have a much bigger crew. And occasionally, these same cats were used as privateers, which meant that they were carrying guns. They were sort of naval reserve, if you like. They were carrying guns. They needed a lot more men. So they were very versatile ships. That's the important thing. And the bottom line is the point that we sometimes forget, but this is the really important one. They used no fuel at all. They could go all the way around the world without using an ounce of fuel, except, as I say, what they used in the galley stove. Now, that's almost magic, but that's what they could do. And they could certainly go up to Greenland and back. When they started putting engines in these in the 1840s and 50s, it didn't work, because the engines took so much space themselves, and the fuel for them, the coal, took even more space, and there wasn't enough space left then for the cargo that they were so good at carrying. So that's when the cats started going out. They were no longer useful. Well, there was another chance to see a cat in action, because Bark Endeavour, the one that the cook used on his, or one of the two that he used on his first voyage, was a Whitby-built cat. This is a replica of it, built in Australia. It was never a whaler itself, but it's a cat, and if you want to see a cat actually on water, then look out for this one. It comes around the world occasionally. I saw it in Whitby itself just a few years ago. And you've got the dimensions there, the length and the beam and the burden. The sail area of 3,300 square yards, enormous sail area for the size of them. Never a whale ship, but that's the closest to a cat we'll see afloat. So you'll see them on the pub sign in Wapping, or you may see it coming down the Thames someday when Endeavour's in port. Well, now, to convert a cat to a whale ship, an ordinary cat could go up the Arctic, but not under the bounty regulations, because the bounty regulations insisted that these ships be properly reinforced against the main source of damage, which was the ice that they had to go through. Well, they reinforced the bow. That made sense. You put extra planks in the bow. You put extra planks all the way around the waterline, and then you fortified them internally with beams in cross-section, and all the way across the ship, and then also some longitudinal ones as well. And this was to account for the possibility of the ice moving in and simply crushing the ship. And it worked quite a lot of the time, not all the time. Most of the ships that were lost in the Arctic, not many on the whole, but the ones that were lost simply by being crushed by the ice. The other ways in which you could make them into whalers was to put crow's nests up. Those were invented by whalers, by one particular whaler, a chap called William Scoresby, who used to sail out of Whitby. Because the masts were a little bit higher than the boat was long, and from there you had a very wide horizon, and you went up there to spot whales, and the captains would sometimes con the ship from there, that is, navigate it and shout the directions down through a megaphone, and it was simply a barrel, often with a hood over it. And before that, they used to go and stand up there just in their overcoats or whatever they had to wear. Well, that was a big improvement on it. And they had two. They went to that one. They used that one mostly, but then occasionally, when the top gallants were up, they would go up there too, and that gave them a better horizon, a wider horizon. And then the other way you could spot a whaler was the davits. For these. Now, they didn't wear those when they were going to and from the whaling grounds. That would have been very dangerous. They would have been washed away. But they put those out all the time that they were in the ice, which was relatively calm conditions, because the ice tended to dampen the sea down, and then they were ready to drop and go away when somebody shouted there's a whale. Now, this bounty was very important. We need to understand its significance. You can see that you can see now what this 40 tons per ship ton actually meant. And it was the intention of the bounty. The reason why the government paid it was to create what was essentially a Royal Naval Reserve of deep-water seamen, highly skilled in small boat work. Of course, whalers were absolutely ideal for that. Bounty was administered by Customs and Excise, and it set all sorts of conditions under which the ship would sail, including the master had to provide a detailed log of the voyage. Now, here's a page out of a log. It was a page of a time when they're actually in the ice and hunting, and on this particular day they killed a whale, so they put that stamp on so it would show up on the page when the customs officer was going through the log at the end to count the number of whales caught and see how much blubber they were actually importing. Now, those documents arising out of the Bounty are immensely valuable nowadays because they're the main evidence that we have of how many voyages actually went, who was on board, how many crew, how much, where they went, what they caught, and so on. Unfortunately, there were about 9,000 voyages, Arctic voyages altogether from Britain. We've only got about 250 logs and journals, which is a very, very small proportion. But we've also got things like muster rolls, which is the numbers of crew and the names of the crew who went on the individual voyages, and we've got all the records of the catches and so on. And those are the raw material of my research and my research group. And this all arises from the documents that they had to turn in to satisfy customs and excise to qualify for the bounty. Now you can see there's a ship of 350 tons that would qualify for £700, and that was either it was enough to fit out a ship for its first voyage, or it paid a lot of the expenses of the actual voyage itself. Now in 1749, London had already started whaling, but in a very small way. That was before the bounty increased from £1.50 as it was to £2. And then as soon as the £2 bounty came in, then everybody got interested, and that's when all the other ports began to work. The bounty continued all the way through. Now the Treasury every year questioned it, and particularly when whaling had taken off and become successful, they were saying, well, why are we still paying a bounty for an industry that's obviously doing very well indeed? But there must have been a very powerful lobby in Parliament, and this is one of the things we're looking into, that kept the bounty going from act to act. Eventually it disappeared in 1824, and from then the industry began to decline. It kept on under its own steam for quite a long time, but it marked a turning point when the industry began to decline, as we'll see. Now, in the early days, these are the few whaling ports that started up. Those are the dates, 1733 to by 1760, those were the whaling ports that were working in Britain. Eventually, we had up to 37 ports. Now, where are they all? Well, they're mostly along the east coast. A lot around Scotland, around the Firth Fort. Very few on the west coast. Well, these ports were mostly concerned with the Atlantic, and they were making the money out of slavery and the tobacco trade and the trade with the American colonies and so on. These were all trading mostly with Europe itself, and very often under keen competition. So when something new, when a new concept came in for these ships, these are the ones who showed most interest and indeed kept on for longest. And you can see some of these ports were in business for a long time. London for just over 100 years. 1733, last one left London in 1836. Whitby, I pointed that out because I have things to say about Whitby later on. 1753 to 1837, that's a long span for a very small town, and so on. And it peaked during this period, and then gradually declined as alternative fuels and lubricants came in. Now, why did people go whaling? It was to get particularly oil and a baleen, which was called whalebone. It wasn't the actual bones of the whale, it was the substance, rather like fingernails, on a stronger scale, that they had in their mouths to filter the food that they were taking out of the sea. This is the number of ships sailing annually to the Arctic. This is a profile, if you like, of the industry as a whole. 37 ports. If you add all the ports. Now, the one thing you can say about it, it wasn't a very stable industry. It wasn't one that went on at a nice even level from year to year. It was up and down all the time. And of course, making sense of that graph is one of the important things we have to do. Well, if you put the walls in as the background, you can immediately begin to see that they exerted some effects. The demand for whale oil increased in wartime because they needed it for processing the cloth for uniforms. They needed it for oiling the muskets and that sort of thing. They needed it for as a general lubricant. They needed it particularly for lighting. So the demand went up, but against that, these ships, these same whaling ships, could be used much more profitably in government service, transporting troops to America during the American War of Independence, transporting them to Europe during the 7 Years' War, and that sort of thing. So you can see some correlations there. In the Napoleonic Wars, they just went up and up and up because all the other sources of whale oil that were available to Britain, from the colonies, for instance, had dried up. So it was a very important and still growing industry at that time. The other major factor that influenced this was the fluctuations of the bounty payment. Every now and again, the Treasury could force down the amount that was being paid because they said the industry was doing too well. And as soon as they did, then the number of ships involved went down, and so on. So there are several other factors coming into it, but gradually we're going to make sense of all these extraordinary fluctuations. Now the bounty stopped there, and you can see that after that a lot of ships lost interest, and after that it continued, and it continued right over here, but mainly in Scotland, where there was a very strong local demand for oil for cloth processing, particularly at Dundee, for instance, for the jute industry. They needed a lot of oil to process the jute, to soften it so it could go through the weaving machines. And that was one market that continued. Otherwise, from about here onwards, for lighting, for example, coal gas was coming in. And later on, of course, the oils, the mineral oils started coming in. One way or another, the big markets for whale products disappeared, and that undermined, of course, the whole reason for the industry. Well, now, where were they actually working? Well, and what were they doing? They were hunting this whale, this particular species, Balena mysticetus, the Greenland bowhead whale, called bowhead because of that enormous lower jaw. That was hiding, as it were, the baleen strips which hang down from the roof of the mouth. When the initial hunting was up to Svalbard, and then they started going round to the Davis Strait. Now, that was longer voyages, so the cost of the voyages were higher, but backward and forth, it added about a month to the voyage. Most of the voyages started out in February, March, and if you got a good catch, you were home by June or July, if you went to Svalbard. If you went here, it was usually at least a month more, and if you went all the way around there, it might be a couple of months more. But the whales here were much fatter. Now, what was actually happening was the whales were migrating up north as the ice disappeared during the summer to get into the really rich feeding grounds which were up there and up there. And the whalers were simply following them. Now, the whalers didn't know at the time that this was a big migration. I mean, we know now, in retrospect, this was a big annual migration. All they knew was that the whales started congregating here, and if they got there at the right time of the year, they could kill them. And on the pictures of whaling scenes, you very often see as many as 20 and 30 sail in sight within the horizon. That's not an exaggeration. It was simply that that group of whalers had found a group of whales who were trying to make their way up north, through and under the ice, had been lucky enough to find them and were all homing in on them. This was one of the factors, incidentally, that made whaling a lot safer than it would otherwise have been. A whaler very seldom was working on his own. He would usually have at least 3 or 4 ships in company, and if one of the ships got caught up in the ice, the men would probably be rescued by the others. I mean, always were if the opportunity arose. And so although ships were lost, quite often the crews were saved by other ships being within hailing distance. Working up into Baffin Bay was quite hazardous because there was this lump of ice left even in the late summer, and if you got let's say a southerly wind, it would move all that up towards there. And if you're up there, then you're liable to be caught. If you're down here coming home along the coast here, and the wind came up from the east, that could catch you against the coast. And so on. There were hazards and there were rewards, and the balance between them. Well, let's have a look at what some of these ships were doing. One thing is they would never have been in the ice under full sail like that. This is to give a nice picture of a sailing ship in its sort of full glory. And I think very beautiful and incredibly effective ships they were. But that's the artist's impression. They would have had the sails down here because if all the men were out in the boats, there'd only be the captain and possibly the cook to actually keep the ship underway. So there'd be 2 or 3 of them, and they wouldn't be able to manage all that sail area. Now the boats were out. Somebody shouted there are whales in the sea. Well, look, there's one there. So all the boats have come out, and they've got all the men on board. They're flencing a whale alongside there. We'll have a closer look at that in a minute. Oh, and there's a polar bear. That's good value for the Arctic. Oh, they've got a whale here. That's its tail. They've caught it, and the 2 boats have got together to tow it back to the ship. Have a closer look at that. There's the ship with the whale being flenced alongside, a lot of birds horning in on the act. Whaleboat, 6-man crews, or 7 sometimes. Harpooner, stood at the bow with a harpoon. The boat steerer, who kept the boat getting onto the whale. The oarsman. Oh, the line coiler. Now, he had about 120 fathoms of line. Multiply that by 2 to get it into meters, or 6 to get it into feet. That's a hell of a lot of line coiled up in the tub, and his job was to see that when it was being paid out, it didn't get tangled up, and the men didn't get their feet caught in it, and that sort of thing. Those were the officers, if you like, the officers and the NCOs, and these were the men. These were the backbone of the ship, if you like. It's interesting to see what they're dressed in. This is the Arctic, and it's in summer, but they look as though they're dressed for Henley. Top hats, the lot. This, I think, was old naval uniform. These would probably been in the Navy for a time and kept bits of the uniform. I don't know, but there's an interesting story there, and people who know more about what the dress of seamen was at that time will probably be able to make more of it. There were just the 2 boats pulling that one in, and just across the water, as it were. Here's a scene of a whale being towed by 1, 2, 3, 4 boat, and they have to go all the way back to the ship there. Now, as you can imagine, if it was a contrary wind and a rather cold one, that would have been one hell of a job. So there was a lot of very hard work involved in whaling. The products of the hunt were the blubber. That was oil, and it was very much in demand through the whole of this period for lighting, lubrication, leather processing, cloth processing. Very often the leather came from seals, which they were catching at the same time. And then the baleen, and that was the whalebone hidden in between these jaws, and that, as I say, was used as a filter for filtering out the plankton, the very small animals and plants in the sea, on which these great whales depended. They hold the blubber inboard. That's what they're doing here. They strip the whale of its blubber, left the carcass to go away. Nobody used the full carcasses of the whale, incidentally wasting about 40% of the oil in the animal's body. And also the baleen, which they cut out of the mouth of the whale, and occasionally they took the jaw bones as well. You'll see one in a moment, because they made gateposts and girders and things like that. They could sell those at home as a sort of a bounty. Here's the whale in section, head on, the tail there. Here's the boat. There's a hoist here that's turning the whale over slowly. And there's a chap there with a sort of spade thing, cutting the blubber, and the other hoist is pulling the blubber up, and he's going to get it up to there and then down onto the deck. These chaps are cutting it up, pushing it down into the tween decks where it's put into barrels, and then the barrels are stowed in there. Now, why did they use barrels? Why not use boxes or something? Well, if you've got a box with half a ton of whale blubber in it, it's going to take a lot of men to move it. If it's in a barrel, you can roll it. And barrels were very easily hoisted, and when they got into the hold, they locked together, so the barrels were made a lot more. Oh, and also, of course, they were made out of staves, so you could put a lot of barrels in the stave form. And then you always had a cooper on board whose job was to make the barrels up as they were needed and gradually fill the hole up. There's baleen. Now these chaps must have been about 5'6" high. Baleen, the longest streaks of baleen would be about 10 to 12 feet. And the longer the baleen, from the bigger the whale, the more value it was. Oh, and there's jawbone. There's one of the jaw bones that supports the baleen. These are all stacked up on the deck here. This is a much later, of course it's a photograph, so it's from about the 1870s, 1880s, I should think, from the things they're wearing. But it was exactly the same back in the period that I'm talking about. Just to put some figures on this, an average-sized whale would lead half a ton of the bone and about 10 tons of oil. Now, a list of things that the bone was used for seems very trivial. Stays, corset stays, umbrella spines, knife handles, things like that, all very small. But it was immensely valuable. It's a ton of whalebone. Could be anything from about 100. This is on the low side. It got up to about 350 pounds a ton when it was at the height of fashion. A great deal of it was needed. Now, if you go down into the museum here, in what they call the modern section up to 1850, you'll see a lot of silk dresses with huge bits sticking out all over the place. That was one of the uses of whalebone. I noticed they talk about the silk in it, but they don't talk about the whalebone, which is what gave the thing its shape. Then later on, of course, it was corsets. Every woman needed corsets of one kind or another. So, as I say, it sounds very trivial, but it was an enormous and very expensive market. The oil, well, we can see. Well, now, the total value then of an average-sized whale would be about that much. Now, I've put in this factor here. What was a pound then worth in modern money? About 1 to 80, but it does depend very much on. Well, it's much more complicated than that. Let me leave it at that. Otherwise, I'll spend the rest of the time talking about this. Just a general guide. Don't try to hang any research on it if that's what you're doing, but you'll know better anyway. Go to a website that tells you what these values are, and you'll see why this is a dodgy figure, but it'll do for the present purpose. Now, if you got 5 or 10 of those in a single voyage, that would be a good catch. If you got 20, you'd be doing very well indeed. Now, I'm interested in the whales, of course, and I'm interested in the whales, but I'm also interested in the communities which took up whaling and what the whaling did for them. Here's a very agreeable little town on the east coast of Great Britain called Whitby. Some of you may know it. And that was a whaling town, and I'm centering a lot of my research on that. One, it's a very pleasant place to work, and two, it's the right sort of size for me to get my head round. In the peak of whaling, they sent 20 ships. Remember, London at the peak sent over 100. Well, that gives you an idea of the scale that I find it much more convenient to work on. And if you look at Whitby now, today, well, that's the harbour, and those are the groins that they built out, the piers they built out to make this estuary into a harbour. If you look the other way, just a very nice, agreeable little harbour. Now imagine that filled up with about 40 cats, all with their spars and so on, as it would have been in the whaling days. Today it's practically all pleasure ships and scuttles and fishing going on. The community built up around the harbour, not a lot of room on the immediate shore, and then there's a church and the remains of an abbey up in the back. Now, if you turn it on its side and compare it with Whitby as it was in 1778, this is the beginning of the whaling. Well, about the middle of that early whaling period. What have we got? We've got an estuary, we've got the groins that protect it. At high tide, all this would be flooded. At low tide, you had a channel, a bridge here to be able to get through, and then an inner harbour, again with a lot of... The Whitby cats, incidentally, were more or less flat-bottomed, so they could sit on the sand when the tide went out without heeling over or doing any harm. And already, whaling had generated more shipyards, more ship repair yards. It had rope walks. It had factories for producing sails and so on. The industry stimulated all the small industries that had previously been there when the cats were just being cats. Now they're being whalers, and they need all this background. So if you look around Whitby today, you can still see a lot of signs of this. You can see the small houses. They're gentrified now, of course. I could have shown you the cottages in which the seamen lived. They've practically all been swept away now because nobody would dream of living in them today. There would be one up, one down cottages. The harpooners and the linesmen and the boat steerers, who were as I say, the sort of officers on the ship, lived in far better conditions, and this would be the sort of cottage that it might even be the sort of cottage that a seaman who had good fortune with his whaling, been with good captains year after year after year, and every year had made a little bit more than he would have made as a fisherman, might be able to get into a cottage like this, which was a tremendous advance on the slums in which all the others lived. The ones who really made the money, of course, were the masters and the ship owners. And Whitby still has a lot of these, very handsome mansions. They're mostly broken up into flats now, or used as offices for lawyers and things like that. But they're still there and very elegant, and they all give you an indication of how important this industry was at this particular time. The late Georgian and the early Victorian period particularly. No, it was before the... it was in the Victorian days that the whole thing stopped. And they have a lot of pride in some of the particular captains who went down to the whaling. Some of the whaling captains, the ones who really got good at this, would go down every year to the Arctic, every year for 40 years, They never saw an English spring for 40 years. That was how dedicated they were, because they were making, if they were good at it, they were making a lot of money. If they were average at it, they were still turning quite a good penny on it. If they were not very good at it, they got out of whaling and went into general service again. William Scoresby Sr. and his son were the two best whalers that Whitby ever produced, and I'd love to come along and give you a lecture on those someday, because they have an awful lot to they had an awful lot to say. Now, just finally, let's get back to these three ships and see what the problem was. They'd got caught up here. They'd gone up they'd gone up into Davis Strait. They got up to Baffin Bay. They'd come all the way around here. They'd got caught up against this island here, Ellesmere, and the ice had come over and it had caught them. And just to go back, there's the land ice, and they were caught up against that. You can see it there. It's about 10 feet thick. That's the land. That's the ice that grows out from the land every year. And this is the pack ice in that rump in the middle that's moved in and trapped them. They've cut docks in the ice. They did that with long 20-foot saws, which needed about 10 men to operate them. Those two have managed to cut the docks. That one hasn't. That's the Jane from Hull. That's the View Force from Kirkcaldy, and that's the Middleton. That was from Aberdeen, and they all got. That one got crushed. The Middleton got crushed and sunk. The men from that transferred to these two. These two got trapped, and then as the ice was moving south all the time under the currents, they had to go with it. And instead of getting back to port by about September, October, they didn't get back until the following February. That is to say, they had to stay over winter in the ice, each of them with an additional 30 men on board from the Middleton. It gave them a very, very hard winter indeed. There's a long story behind that too. Well, there we are. Keep those ships in mind. We'll go back to the beginning, and that's where we came in. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.